As we pilgrimage through Lent, our lectionary feels more than anything else to me like stepping stones placed carefully across a marshy and obscure landscape. Each week, carrying us a bit further toward Jerusalem as we explore God's extraordinary, groundbreaking covenants and how they shape us, our community, and the world. This morning we hear God speak his 10 great and primary commandments to the awed and frightened Israelites. And we also hear Jesus upend the business of the corrupt authorities to the awed and frightened temple worshipers. In both of these acts, God's identity and expectations of his people become more clear. In the past few weeks, we have closely tracked the covenants that God has been establishing with human beings almost from the beginning. We looked at the crisis of Noah, the last good man, and the flood that consumed the corrupted creation. We came to at least a partial understanding that the Bible understands that underlying life itself, there is a kind of chaos, both primordial and personal and immediate to us in our own situations and inevitable struggles. And God established his first covenant with Noah as a means of lifting Noah and his offspring, and that includes us, out of the never-ending chaos that might engulf us. Then we met Abraham, a righteous and trusting man. We watched as God chose Abraham and made another covenant with him based upon the promises and mutual trust that they agreed to. God sent Abraham willingly on an adventure into the unknown. And through fidelity to this relationship, Abraham gained place and prosperity and a miraculous family that would seed the world with this covenant with the one true God. But one of the really remarkable things about the Bible, and one of the things that keeps me coming back to it over and over and over again and digging deeper and deeper, is that it's never a straight shot from God's dream to human behavior. It's really lifelike in the way it portrays human beings. Human beings always somehow make a mess of things, perhaps reflecting the underlying chaos, always just nipping at our heels. So our reading today finds us at another crucial moment of chaos and uncertainty for the biblical community, where God intervenes to lift his confused children into a new kind of consciousness, which is always, in some sense, I think, the purpose of these renewed and growing and more inclusive covenants. The Israelites by now have been wandering for years in the desert, and Moses, another earnest but imperfect man, a fugitive murderer who can't speak properly, let's remember, is God's choice to lead them. They have been going this way and that and arguing and fighting and complain about each other, for years. And throughout, Moses has been their judge and arbiter. You can just imagine him mediating arguments, negotiating, trying to avert violence, seeking to keep the peace. No doubt, really trying hard to understand what keeping the peace means, what peace would look like for this band of hungry, thirsty, traumatized refugees. Finally, just before our reading this morning, echoing his conversations with Noah and Abraham, God says to Moses, "Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession." God then gathers all the Jewish people at the foot of the Sinai mountain, the holy mountain, and literally speaks these 10 laws to them. But I don't think that God just made these laws up on the spot. Many of these rules and guidelines for establishing justice, keeping the peace, and creating healthy, workable relationships between God and among people, these wouldn't have been entirely new to the Israelites, having lived together and wandered together for decades now. God simply says, remember that I am God, and that you were made in my image, and that every single one of you is precious to me. Keep what is holy, holy. Don't lie, don't cheat, and don't mistreat one another in any way, and don't kill each other. And these laws, without exception, again, apply to every single human being equally. I am God. And we noticed last week that through sacrifice, human beings in some way discovered the future. That it's best to give up something now for the hope of something better for a future time. Well, this week we have another marvel, another novelty introduced into the human discourse. We can marvel just as much this week that this covenant, these laws that applied universally to every single person, irrespective of birth, wealth, position, or status, in some ways we are witnessing here the birth of the idea of the equality of all people before the law. The equal value of every human being, which lies at the base of our own legal system, and one could say our civilization. Every person made in the image of God has intrinsic value and is valued and embraced under his protection and steadfast love. No one is above the law. If that sounds familiar, it should. And what does God demand right after he presents these laws and the Israelites agree? Sacrifice. The Israelites are told to build an altar and make burnt and fellowship sacrifices to their sheep and goats. They are to mark this transformation, this new life they now have promised to them by offering up their most precious possessions, that which means the most to them, in this case, their herds. They're the basis of their wealth, of their life in the world, to ensure their future. Through this one act of God delivering a set of laws dictating fair and just behavior that applies to everyone, even Moses, the great liberator and prophet, a new kind of human freedom and responsibility is born. Prior to this, of course, final human power and authority almost always resided in individuals, kings, pharaohs, and of course in Jesus' time, emperors. We have to understand how profound and groundbreaking this development in the archaic life of these peoples actually was. Human beings, through this relationship with the divine, have been somehow able to extract the concept of sovereignty out of the reality of human power structures and let it reside in a deity who held every one of them in love and accountable. It was a quantum leap forward in human social evolution. A quantum leap forward in human social evolution. The ideal of a sovereignty beyond any individual person is what makes societies like ours, with our modern rulers, presidents, or prime ministers, theoretically subject to the same laws as everybody else. By Moses' time, God and his human family have been together for quite some time, and the relationship with human beings slowly formed literally over thousands of years. God had been continually offering ways for we human beings to be lifted above the chaos of our self-serving and self-destructive natures, to be made more fruitful and humane through these covenantal relationships. He made it clear in stark, unmistakable terms that behavior and honoring an ideal of mutual respect and fair dealing and fair-mindedness with him and with one another was extremely important to God. False shows of piety, acting, as we say, holier than thou or high and mighty, as prophets like Amos and Ezekiel and our gospel stories continually tell us, just don't cut it. They mean less than nothing. Using the Lord's name in vain, using God's name or spirit as a slogan or as a means of self-aggrandizement is specifically prohibited in the Ten Commandments themselves, which are, after all, simply distillations, top 10 list, if you will, of a much broader set of laws that God gave to Moses in the Deuteronomical Code. And falsely selling God's grace for profit must have been then and remains perhaps the most despicable sort of insult to God. Just ask Martin Luther. The medieval Roman Catholic practice of selling indulgences, literally selling tickets to heaven to enrich the church, sparked the Protestant revolution in Europe in the 16th century and changed the church forever. So it's really important to understand that with all this as a backdrop, it's really not hard to see why Jesus, God's incarnated self, got really, really, really angry in the temple in our gospel story this morning. The very leaders entrusted with upholding these covenants, the high priest, certain high-level Pharisees, and other temple authorities, were themselves betraying the very core of what God had been trying to build with his stiff-necked people over centuries, over millennia. In the Gospel of John, unlike the other Gospels, this scene of Jesus clearing the temple occurs almost at the very beginning of the story, thus dangerously pitting Jesus against the most powerful political and religious forces of his time almost immediately. But Jesus does more than interrupt the corruption of temple business and put its operators on notice. He names himself the new temple, the new embodiment of God, a living and incorruptible replacement for the temple itself. And he speaks of his death and resurrection in 3 days in such unmistakable terms that the disciples recall them after his death. And it causes them to actually trust him more after he is gone. And this claim, probably more than any other, constitutes his death sentence in Jerusalem. But what really matters most for us, in my view, is this is not just a grand gesture by Jesus, a grand, dramatic, cinematic gesture, to upend a vicious system whereby some invoke God's name to enrich and empower themselves, thus ensnaring and thus ensuring the fulfillment of his messianic mission. It's more than that. It's a model for our own responsibility and behavior. We also are asked to remember the promises we make, that we have made and we continue to make, whose we are, and to transcend the corruption and chaos of our time and stand with all of God's people, particularly those who are getting a raw deal. Now, the most obvious targets for this sort of anger or this sort of approach of dealing with corruption that we might see are sort of the television evangelists, the Osteens or the Swaggarts or what have you, who are living in million-dollar mansions while all around them social, political, and economic chaos overwhelm many in the society around them. But it's also much more than that. We have to recognize that Jesus wasn't going to a local megachurch or a synagogue and throwing everybody out. He went to the equivalent of the Capitol building in Washington and interrupted a session of Congress. Last week you heard me say we must address the evil of gun violence and the corrupt systems that enable it. I hope you read my message in the cloak this week, where there are some things that we can start doing together to at least address this as responsible citizens and as faithful, loving Christian people. But guns aren't the only false gods that we have to confront. Love of personal wealth at the expense of the many, however we want to conceive or justify it, will eventually eat us alive as a society if we don't address it and find more fair and workable ways to uplift all of God's people in a manner that empowers them to live more full, fruitful, and wholesome lives. In the end, to the covenant with God that we are heirs to, that we participate in. We are not the awed and frightened bystanders in the temple when the purifying rage of Jesus cleanses and sanctifies the temple. As followers of Jesus, we are to follow his example and find ways to bring holiness to the chaos, love to the brokenness around us, and all of it in the name of God. In the ultimate sacrifice, Jesus died on the cross to bring us nearer to this truth. So what are we willing to do? What will our sacrifice to move God's love forward look like? In the name of the one true God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.